again why day in and day out there is so much surplus on the Gaza side of Kerem Shalom that is not being distributed.
I don't mean to be funny, but I get his point that, maybe Hamas are trying to manipulate this because they want the starving people, because they want the empathy from the West, but you're the governing party, you're the one involved in this war. It's not for the UN or charity organisations to do your job, and I don't know why Israel seems to rely on that. It's their duty under the Geneva Convention to, if they are the occupying power, to supply aid, because they're taking it away. And therefore to say, oh well, in the NGOs and UN, why aren't they doing enough?
Question from Lior Soroka at the Washington Post. Can you confirm that Netanyahu and Burns' meeting has ended? I cannot confirm that. The Prime Minister's office will release a statement if needed, when appropriate. Thank you. Second question from David Clement at the News Forum in Canada. British MPs were briefed in a committee hearing that the best estimate on the civilian to combatant casualty ratio in the war against Hamas is 1-to-1. Is there any accuracy in that claim?
1-to-1.
I can tell you that we are still firmly in the fog of war. I know my Prime Minister has said in the past that it's potentially even better than 1-to-1. One thing that we know for sure, is that Israel at the moment appears to be operating in a way unprecedented, in a way that is unprecedented to avoid civilian casualties. And we will continue to do that for the sake of international law, and also because it's part of the very fabric of our ethos as the Jewish people in the one and only Jewish state, to avoid civilian casualties and go after those terrorists that seek our absolute destruction.
I get the point on the absolute destruction, and I know there's parts of the West that probably have an anti-Semitic view, and that's wrong. But I don't know, this statement of saying that, we're not killing very many civilians, either he's telling the truth and the Western media are lying to us, and I know we're using Hamas figures and that they may be manipulating that, but the UN, unless they're compromised as well, and other NGOs don't seem to be countering these figures, that it seems to be there's a lot of casualties, more than most wars of the modern age, and therefore that statement is either telling the truth and the rest of us are lying, which is possible, or he's telling a lie of tremendous scale, and that worries you, because if he thinks that he can just get away with saying that when it's quite obvious that it isn't the case, because that's a big issue. It's okay to defend yourself. No, well, not, I don't believe it is, but the Western world, the system we live in, believes that it's okay to fight people to defend yourself. I don't believe in us fighting each other. It's not about the defence part, but I know that's idealistic. But the fact that the casualty number, the problem is that I don't know how we'll ever get to that, because they don't let Western journalists in, or people to count. I don't know, maybe the UN could take up the counting rather than Hamas, but I suppose that's not possible, I don't know, but that's very contentious.
Thank you. Third question from Joel Pollack at Breitbart News. Does Israel's control of the Rafah crossing and Philadelphia route give Israel greater flexibility to reach a hostage deal with Hamas? So Joel, great question. We will continue to keep up the military pressure on Hamas. We know from the last hostage release that we needed both the military pressure and the diplomatic channel. Ultimately, Hamas was brought down to their knees, begging pleas for a bit of respite, for a break in the fighting, so they could release around half of the hostages. We are continuing on our mission in Rafah as part of the war aims, because the last four battalions of Hamas are there. We will destroy them. But certainly
Well, then we'll step away from Avi Hyman giving a briefing on the current situation from the Israeli government, asking some questions from journalists there. Let's bring in Palestinian political analyst and women's rights expert Reham Auda, who joins us now from Istanbul. Good to talk to you today. I'm not sure if you were able to hear everything that Mr. Hyman was saying there. A lot of discussion about aid getting into Gaza and especially what's happening with the Kerem Shalom crossing. In general, what's your reaction to what's happened over the last 24 hours?
Okay, I just want to comment that he said that he will free Gaza Strip from Hamas. But what we see in the ground, Israeli government trying to free Gaza Strip from its civilians, because more than 35,000 of civilians have been killed during this bloody war. We didn't see on the ground any protection measure taken by Israeli government to protect the lives of Palestinian civilians who have nothing to do with the October attack. They do collective punishment. For example, they started the operation in Rafah after they made many promises for American administration that they will prepare a humanitarian zone at Al Mawasi and that they will buy at least 40,000 tents to host internal displaced people from Gaza Strip. We don't see anything. Al Mawasi, it's empty. No tents for people to be hosted when they have been evacuated in the midnight. During the last 2 days, many civilians were killed. And this is really against the statement of Israeli government that says that they are not targeting civilians. So if Israel wants to fight, but fight at least in ethical way. Don't do collective punishment against Palestinian civilians under the justification that they are targeting Hamas. Regarding Kerem Abu Salim, until now, according to United Nations, we didn't see any humanitarian goods enter Gaza Strip, and people still suffering. I think that Israel used this policy to put pressure on both parties, on Hamas and also on civilian people, to leave Gaza Strip.
And in terms of what he was saying there about there being aid on the Gaza side of the Kerem Shalom crossing that isn't being distributed into Gaza, what do you make of that?
There is a problem, logistic problem for the goods to enter Gaza, because there is no ceasefire until now. There is clashes, there is exchange of fire, so it is dangerous for humanitarian aid workers to work in the field. And I think there is a weak coordination between Israeli army and international humanitarian organizations that take the lead of distribution of humanitarian aid. You know, UNRWA is the big international humanitarian organization that works in Gaza Strip, and its relationship with Israeli government is very bad. So their rule is not effective in this war, because they are punished by Israeli government. We have World Food Program also, it has limited rules. The situation is dangerous and it prevents any humanitarian aid worker to work in safe place. So we need from Israeli government at least to guarantee that no risk on humanitarian aid workers, so they can distribute this food package for innocent people. So this is the issue.
And Reham, do you think there's any hope that the diplomacy that is going on aside from all of this in Cairo will actually bear any fruit?
Regarding what is happening in Cairo now, regarding negotiation process, I think after Rafah operation, I don't have a big hope. Hamas insists that Israel should end the war as soon as possible. However, Israel say, yes, I can stop Rafah operation until they free the first hostage, but they will not accept to end the war. So this is the issue. So I think it is very complex situation. Plus, I think Hamas is not ready to make a hostage deal for 33 alive hostages, because they said that they have 18 alive hostages and they are ready to make a deal with dead hostages. And this is not accepted by Israel. So there is a many problem and difficult points in this deal, and I don't expect that we will have this deal soon. Maybe at least if there is a deal, it will be for a short time, And if Israel continue its war, it will be a deal for dead people, not for alive people, unfortunately.
Okay, it's a gloomy thought. Graham Auda, Palestinian political analyst. Good to talk to you. Thank you for joining us today.
Welcome.
Well, the Israeli Defense Forces say that they're conducting, in their words, a precise counter-terrorism operation in specific areas of eastern Rafah. With me now is military analyst, Professor Michael Clark. Michael, is this the start of a full offensive in Rafah, or is it very, very targeted?
Well, it could be the start of something, Jane. The IDF have given themselves the option of that, because what they've done is they've taken the Rafah crossing, they've just moved in on it, and they control both the Kerem Shalom crossing and now the Rafah crossing. And so what they've done is they've put an armoured division, an armoured brigade at the Rafah crossing, the 401st Armoured Brigade, and then the 84th Infantry Brigade is holding the road. So they've got about 25% of what's known as the Philadelphia corridor, which runs all the way to the coast. So this is the Rafah crossing. This is not Rafah City. Rafah City is here. So they're still a long way away from Rafah City, but by a long way, that's relative, because this whole distance is only about 9 miles. But there they are. They're about 3 miles, 2.5 to 3 miles into a 9-mile stretch. And overnight, there have been over 100 attacks from the Israeli Air Force in that area, so they're not letting up on bombing areas that they think contain terrorist facilities or tunnels. I mean, it's pretty bad in any case in terms of Rafah City. So they've given themselves the option of conducting what we suspect would be an operation to control the whole Philadelphia corridor and then maybe move from the south against Rafah, or if politics and what's going on in Cairo and the peace talks, if that seems to bear fruit, to stay where they are. But in controlling the Kerem Shalom crossing and the Rafah crossing, of course, there's some dispute as to whether anything's going through the Kerem Shalom crossing. It is open, but it's not clear whether anything is going through it. Rafah is closed at the moment, and all of the fuel for Gaza goes through Rafah. And the aid agencies are saying that they've only got 1 day's fuel left, and fuel is absolutely indispensable to the humanitarian operation. So something is going to have to give at one or both of those crossings in the next 24 hours, or the situation across the whole of Gaza will get considerably worse.
And Michael, what about this pausing of the US shipment of bombs to Israel? How significant is it, and what sort of bombs were they?
Yeah, well, it was 3,500 bombs, quite a lot, and about half of them were these very heavy 2,000-pound bombs, which is almost a ton of explosives. Those are pretty big. The other half were 500-pound bombs, more conventional ones. And the point is, these are the bombs that the IDF have been using to go after either buildings or tunnels where they want to actually get under the ground to do a lot of damage to whatever they thought was underground. But of course, these are the sort of bombs that have been doing a great deal of damage to the civilian population. Now, the Americans have been talking about this and hinting about it for some weeks, that they might slow down deliveries. They won't stop them, but they might slow them down. And the fact that they have now let it be known that they did slow down deliveries of these particular sorts of bombs, which are very offensive in the context of the whole operation. These are not defensive munitions like air defense against Iranian missiles. These are bombs being used against Gaza, and they're the big ones. The fact that the Americans let that be known is obviously politically important, and they've let it be known that they're reviewing some future requirements where the Israelis were asking for these JDAM packs, as they're called, which is a way of making bombs much more precise, and these small diameter bombs, very precise. And the Americans, they're not due to deliver those yet, but they're saying they're reviewing their decision to supply these sorts of weapons. So the Americans actually are putting a lot of pressure on the IDF and on Netanyahu to say, although we will support you militarily, of course we will, Joe Biden keeps saying that, we are actually playing a different game with the way in which we'll support you, because unless you actually relent on the severity of this military operation, we will not supply you with the things that are doing the most damage to the civilian population.
Michael, thank you very much. You're watching Sky News Today. Coming up, the Home Secretary says a Russian...
There you go. That's the life we live, huh?
Still blue. Go, Daddy, with you all the way.
We'll be following that story very closely. Now back to our lead story in the Middle East. Israeli officials are on their way to Cairo to resume talks on a potential ceasefire after rejecting the latest proposal outlined by Egyptian and Qatari mediators. Now, the images that you're looking at right now were the scenes on the streets of Rafah yesterday as news filtered through that Hamas had accepted that very same proposal. It's a frustrating situation for those who only wish to be reunited with their loved ones. I'm joined now by Gil Dickman, whose cousin is believed to be held captive in Gaza. Gil's aunt, Kinneret, was killed when Hamas stormed Kibbutz Be'eri on October the 7th. Gil, thank you so much for joining us here on the program. I mean, it's been such a difficult 7 months for the families of these hostages. Just tell us about your feelings and thoughts on how things have developed over the last 24 hours.
Well, it's a roller coaster, and we've had such a roller coaster for the last 7 months. But in the last 24 hours, we've heard that Hamas said yes to the proposal, and then we've heard that it actually gave a proposal of its own, and that Israel has said no, and then that Israel is going into negotiations about the proposal. We are trying to shut off all that news because so much of it is psychological terror, and so much of it is given to us from the very terror organization that killed our loved ones and still holds our loved ones. We try to focus on what matters, and what matters is that there is actually a deal that could be reached between the two sides. That's for sure. And the White House has said that in the last few hours. There's a reachable deal that can bring an end to this tragedy, that can bring a ceasefire, and of course bring the hostages back home. We feel that the world has forgotten about some of these hostages, but there are still women, innocent women, still 2 babies being held by this horrible terror organization, and men and women of all ages. We're waiting for them to come home, and I still think that this is possible.
We are going to be on the program speaking to an Israeli government official. What would you say to him? You know, of course, I understand your feelings towards Hamas, but the fact that the Netanyahu government has said, look, regardless of whatever deal is on the table, we are going to go into Rafah. What would you say to Israeli government officials tonight?
Well, I've been demonstrating in the last few days, and I've been very vocal about it inside Israel. And I can say it also here, that we are frightened of the activity in Rafah. We are what we think about is the risk that this could pose to our loved ones and for all the hostages, and that it could risk the deal. And what we heard is that the Prime Minister and other officials in Israel saying during the last Saturday that they would go into Rafah anyway, regardless of whether there is a deal or not. It looks like this puts the negotiations at risk, and maybe even brought a different answer from Hamas. And what I expect them to do is to put anything and everything aside, not to think about politics and not to think about their own political future, but only about the lives of the hostages, the lives of the Israeli people that were left alone on October 7th, and right now feel when they see and when they watch the news, if they get the news there in the tunnels of Gaza, that they've been abandoned again. They must know, and we must know, that the Israeli government is doing whatever they can, whatever is possible to get a deal that will bring them back home. I know that this is possible, and I want to hear them and see them doing all the things that they need to do to make sure that this deal is reachable, is being reached, and as quickly as possible, because time is running out. That hostages that we know that were alive just a few, just on the 50th or the 60th day, are now dead, and they were murdered by Hamas. Some of them were killed by the IDF fire. We have to make sure that this deal is being reached as quickly as possible before they're going to get hurt.
Gil, we're so grateful for your time. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, Gil was talking there about the hostages and the situation for all of those hostage families desperately waiting for some news. But let's just focus on the situation in Gaza now. The Israeli military now has complete control over the Gaza side of the Rafah border crossing with Egypt. This evening, Hamas has warned Israel that there will be no ceasefire deal if it continues its operations in Rafah, which is exactly what Gil said that he and his family and all the other hostage families fear. Our international correspondent, John Sparks, reports from Jerusalem.
They weren't going to wait for an invitation. These are Israeli tanks, decked with flags, muscling their way into southern Gaza. A powerful symbol of Israeli intent in an area still under Hamas control. The seizure of the Rafah crossing was described as a limited counter-terrorism operation. But it may prove far larger than that. Israel's prime minister says he won't stop until Hamas is destroyed.
Seizing the crossing in Rafah is a very important step on the way to destroying the remaining military capabilities of Hamas, including the destruction of the 4 terrorist battalions.
Military pressure works, the dominant view taking hold in Netanyahu's cabinet. Here, Defense Minister Yoav Gallant visits units deployed near Rafah, and he pledged to deepen the operation all over the Strip. But it only fuels anxiety here. Museum Square in Tel Aviv, which has been turned into a commemoration center for 132 captives still held by Hamas. Most people here want Netanyahu to make a deal, an agreement to get the hostages out.
What I can say is we must take what we can get and start a deal.
Take a deal.
Take a deal, yeah.
This is Yehuda Cohen. His 19-year-old son, Nimrod, has been held prisoner for the past 7 months.
So we know he was taken alive and he got there alive, and we hope he's still alive.
Mr. Cohen is frustrated, like the family members of other hostages. There's a ceasefire proposal on the table that's been agreed by Hamas, and he thinks the government is stalling.
I met yesterday with the Minister of Defense, Yoav Gallant, and I asked him, is the government agreeing of a total ceasefire for releasing of the hostages, of all the hostages? I didn't get a direct answer. I asked the same question a few weeks ago, face-to-face to Netanyahu. I didn't get an answer.
31-year-old Doron Steinbrecher was taken by Hamas from her home at a kibbutz. The only proof of her abduction, a solitary message on WhatsApp. They've arrived. They have me, she wrote.
Like you can see, she's young and beautiful. And
this picture was taken...
Yeah, it's taken the time some weeks before they take her.
Her mother, Simona, thinks of little else. Doron was her baby, the youngest of 3 kids. There must be a voice in your head that is saying, take the deal. Take a deal, take the deal, any deal.
Not only me, all the other family of the hostages say that take it, make the deal, because we must begin to take the hostages out. And we can't do it alone.
The fear of war is widely felt. This is Al-Mawasi, the so-called humanitarian area where the Israelis ordered some residents in Rafah to evacuate. It's woefully inadequate, say the aid agencies. A humanitarian nightmare, says the UN. It seems there's nowhere left to hide from this calamity. John Sparks, Sky News, Tel Aviv.
Okay, let's look now at actually what's going on inside Gaza. Now, around 1.4 million people are sheltering in Rafah. Many of them have been instructed to move to the coastal area of Al-Mawasi, which the IDF has designated as a humanitarian safe zone. Well, with me now in the studio tonight is Wafa Shamalach, who has a number of family members inside the city of Rafah. Wafa, thank you very much for joining us here on the program. Just tell us, you have your sister and her family, the children are all in Rafah. When did you last speak to them and what are they saying?
This morning they were evacuating from Rafah to Al-Mawasi area in Khan Yunis.
What are they saying about the situation on the ground at the moment?
They were shocked by the news just yesterday they were celebrating that Hamas had agreed on the deal, and like many Gazans family, they were celebrating, thinking about going back to their homes, which is not there anymore, but at least to go check on the place where they were. But unfortunately, the news today and the invasion of the military action into Rafah today that put everything to the 0 point. Like the same concerns. They were evacuated to Rafah to seek safety for them and their kids. And now they had to move again, which this is the 5th time they had to move from a place to
place. So they've moved 5 times.
Yes.
Where did they move from originally?
From Gaza City. My family lives in Sheikh Ajrin area, which is on the southwest of Gaza City. The whole area is completely destroyed. Our family house, my house, our relatives' houses. It's been all destroyed and flattened.
You've lost a number of family members as well.
7 months ago, on the 8th of October, I lost 10 members of my family on one go, my uncle and his whole family. And I actually lost 13 people of my immediate family in total, and more than 120 from my extended family.
And now your sister, her husband, the children are on the move. How many children are there with them?
4 children. I have another brother who they were all together with my sister, and he has 5 children with his wife. They had to move from Rafah Yebna camp, the place where the IDF classified as safe zone. Now they had to move again.
They've moved, or they're moving to Al-Mawasi, which
they did move this
they
morning,
did, and they were told that would be a safe zone. Where are they living? What are they eating?
Just yesterday they were living in Rafah.
But in terms of, do they have a tent in Al-Mawasi? What do they have in terms
they
of
had
supplies?
to build up a tent using like woods and fabrics just to make a basic shelter for them, because it was unplanned. They thought that a ceasefire deal will be like soon, so we didn't thought that they had to move again from Rafah. So this morning my brother-in-law and my brother, they had to build up a tent, a basic tent, just using woods and fabric.
What are they saying about what may happen next? Do they have no idea what is going to happen?
They are scared. They lost hope. Just yesterday they were very optimistic and celebrating, and they thought, yeah, we are going back home. This nonsense will stop, and their children's life will be saved. But today they lost every little hope. Nothing left now. What the IDF classified as a safe zone, now it's not a safe zone anymore. And even in Mawasi, it's not. There is no safe place in Gaza, basically.
And we know that Rafah border crossing, where the aid was coming through, is closed. Where are they getting food supplies from?
From the Rafah crossing is the main and the only artery for Gaza to pass the humanitarian aid and for people to pass. But the main risk actually of the military action to Rafah today and the closure of the Rafah crossing, that means that neither people will be allowed, people who are like critically sick or injured, they cannot move to safety and seek medical attention, and nor the humanitarian aid will be passed to Gaza, and whatever left now in Rafah from food or aids in general, the prices will be skyrocketed.
Wafa, we're really grateful that you've joined us and shared your family story with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, as we've been hearing, one of the main concerns has been the flow of aid to Palestinians in Gaza. The two main crossings at Rafah and at Kerem Shalom are now closed, the latter after a Hamas attack on Sunday. Well, I'm joined now by the Israeli government spokesperson, Avi Hyman. Mr. Hyman, thank you very much for joining us here on the program. We've spoken with someone from a hostage family. We've also spoken to someone who has family members stuck in Rafah. The point that our last guest just made was her family members, like so many others in Gaza, have been told to move multiple times, eventually told to go to Rafah where it would be safe. You're now asking them to leave again because of another operation that's been launched. Just your response to that.
Yada, thank you so much for having me on. I'm sorry I missed you when you were in Israel. This is an awful situation. It's an awful situation that we didn't choose, that we didn't want, but we have to continue with. We have to go after the last 4 battalions of Hamas that are holed up in Rafah. I myself am the son of a refugee. My heart goes out to her family and all those families, the civilians caught up in this awful war that Hamas started. But we owe it to the people of Israel and to the people of Gaza to ensure that Hamas no longer controls Gaza.
Well, what we're hearing over and over again, Avi, from the people of Israel, certainly from Gil Dickman, who just spoke to us, and like so many other hostage families, they're saying a ceasefire proposal was put on the table. Their government denied them the chance to be reunited.
The only problem is that there was a ceasefire previous to this that Israel did accept and Hamas didn't. So, like, they're both playing the games, isn't it?
Their government denied them the chance to be reunited with their family members.
So, obviously, I can't fathom the pain that the hostage families are going through. I've got my own friend, Rabbi Doron Peret's son, Daniel, is being held. He was killed on October 7th and is being held. I understand the pain, and every single Israeli wants nothing more than to see those hostages reunited with their family. Unfortunately, once again, Hamas is playing games. We saw they went out to the international press yesterday and said, we've accepted a deal. Well, what deal have you accepted? It's not a deal that's anywhere close to our very basic requirements. For example, they're demanding the end to the war. We can't end the war. We made it very clear from day one.
I mean, are these battalions more important right now for you than the hostages being released? Because obviously an operation in Rafah will also put the hostages who have been kept there. We know a number of them have died. We saw the hostages who were waving white flags that were killed by the IDF themselves. This will further endanger those hostages as well.
Yada, I would argue the opposite of that, actually, because we have a historic precedent. We already have had about half the hostages come home. And the reason that they came home, from our assessment, is twofold, is the military pressure that was put on Hamas to the extent that they had to accept a diplomatic deal. So we will plow forward and go after the last 4 battalions because we have to. I mean, the Prime Minister said, with or without a deal, we have to ensure that Hamas doesn't control Gaza, not politically, not militarily.
And Avi, I mean, we've been aware of that. I mean, your allies, your closest allies have said they don't agree with the Rafah operation. The US president 2 months ago said it was a red line. Just in the last 24 hours, France has reiterated their strongest opposition to this offensive. They've said that the forced displacement of a civilian population constitutes a war crime under international law.
No, I mean, I'm not sure what people are asking us to do. Are they asking us to leave the civilians where they are so that Hamas can use them as human shields? That doesn't make a lot of sense to me.
I mean,
Hamas has spent the last 16 years embedding themselves.
1.4 million people are crammed into Rafah because the IDF asked them to move there because it would be a safe zone. UNICEF is saying that there is nowhere safe for anyone to go in Gaza, and 600,000 children of Rafah are at risk. They say hundreds of thousands of children in Rafah have been injured, sick, malnourished, traumatized, or living with a disability, and that children should not be asked to move again.
So essentially what a UN organization is saying is that Hamas should be allowed to use human shields. They're empowering them to use human shields. And that's not something that we can stand for. We're asking people, as we've already done throughout the war, to get out of harm's way in a way that other armies do not do, so they could be safe. Because our fight is with Hamas, not the people of Gaza.
34,000 people dead, and I know you'll say that it's Hamas's numbers, but they're the numbers now that the US president is using. They're the numbers that your staunchest and closest of allies are using. Whatever you say, Avi, this is what it looks like now, that there's 1.4 million people pushed into Rafah. 34,000 people have been left dead as a result of this war. And you may or may not say, look, it's 8,000 or 10,000 or 13,000 Hamas fighters have been killed, but the leadership has not been eliminated. And now, for the sake of a handful of battalions, you're putting the lives of more Israeli hostages who were let down on October the 7th because of the Israeli security failure, are now at risk again because of this operation.
Yalda, you and I know that Hamas wants to do October 7th again and again and again. We know that because they've said it, and they mean it. And that means that we need to ensure that they don't control Gaza, that not militarily and not politically. And we need to build a better future for the people of Gaza and for the people of Israel, which we can only do once that genocidal terrorist organization is taken down. That's what we have to do. And we also have to bring home the hostages. Now, whether we do that militarily, or whether we do that with a carrot or a stick, or whether we do that with using diplomatic channels, we will bring home the hostages. We will destroy Hamas, and we will ensure that Gaza doesn't pose a threat to us anymore.
We continue to hear this phrase, total victory. But we also hear mixed messages where Israeli spokespeople have also said they understand that Hamas won't be fully eliminated. Is that the case, that it's unlikely that Hamas will be fully eliminated from Gaza, and it's just these battalions you're going after?
So the Prime Minister's made it clear on a number of occasions that what we need to do is to smash the battalions, smash them in a way that they're not operationally active. They can't operate as a military, which is what they do now. Hamas cannot be in control politically or militarily of Gaza. Now, if you're asking me, can we kill an idea, which I'm often asked, obviously, no, you can't kill an idea. I'm sure there's still people in London with ISIS flags up on their bedroom, but ISIS doesn't control the territory.
And there are now thousands of orphans and a built-up resentment because of this level of the operations that have been launched on the Palestinian people for 7 months. And you don't think that is feeding into Hamas's ideology and this resentment towards Israel?
Well, again, there are people with Nazi flags up in London. There are people that march saying they have the Nazi philosophy, but Germany is no longer run by the Nazis. That's the difference. ISIS is the same thing. So what we will need to do after the war, as the Prime Minister has said, is to demilitarize Gaza and de-radicalize Gaza. While I would read my kids The Hungry Caterpillar, they're reading about martyrs that killed Jews, innocent Jews in cold blood. And these are books that come with a stamp of approval from the Palestinian Ministry of Education. So we need to seriously de-radicalize in the same way that was done in Nazi Germany. We need to build a better future for our children and for their children. But first, Hamas needs to be destroyed and the hostages need to come home.
Avi Hyman, thank you very much for joining us here on the program.
Thank you.
Okay, just a reminder now of our breaking news this hour.
Okay, what's that? Next is from the UN. Lloyd Austin, US Defense Secretary.
Accounting for and protecting the civilians that are in that battle space. And again, as we have assessed the situation, we paused one shipment of high payload munitions.
It seems the Israelis aren't listening. They've warned people to evacuate from the eastern side of Rafah, and hundreds of thousands have taken to the road, including May and her children, here perched on a cart. She's been displaced 4 times since the fighting in Gaza began.
As you can see, here we are. We don't know what lies around the corner. There's no safe place in Gaza. Even here. God help us.
Anything of value has been packed into their cart, now heading to a place called Al-Mawasi. It's been designated by Israel as a humanitarian area, but the aid agencies have called it a nightmare. Now we've got a situation where you've got hundreds of thousands of people on the move again to a so-called humanitarian area. Are you prepared for that?
No one is prepared to deal with the forced displacement of 1.4 million people. It's not possible. It's actually just not possible. I don't even think if all the supplies we needed and wanted were in the Gaza Strip, it would be possible to help.
That's been disputed by the Israeli government. Officials say they facilitated a surplus of aid and reopened this crossing called Kerem Shalom after a Hamas attack. But the UN says the assistance hasn't reached them.
No aid has been received in the Gaza Strip. No aid and no fuel. So this is the 3rd day now that we have received no humanitarian supplies.
Another strike is met with a collective cry of terror. The aftermath then blots out the sun. Israel's leaders say they're eliminating Hamas and its terrorist infrastructure as they seek total victory. But their critics accuse them of a catastrophe. John Sparks, Sky News, Jerusalem.
Well, as we've been reporting here on the programme over the last couple of days, UNICEF says there is nowhere safe for some 600,000 children who are stuck in Rafah. The children's charity says over 850,000 kids across the Gaza Strip are now internally displaced, and that thousands have been injured or killed. Well, joining me now in the studio are 2 doctors who have seen for themselves the impact the war is having on children, Dr. Hassan Abu Sita and Dr. Victoria Rose. Thank you both for joining us here on the programme. Dr. Rose, you've just recently returned from Gaza, and we have some of your footage from there. I'm just going to play that for our viewers.
You have to save everything. So this is the towel that my gown was in, which I'm going to save because we'll probably use that as some sort of undersheets because we don't have a lot of drapes. We're often using the gown to drape.
Victoria, that's your image there, but you know, Dr. Abu Sita, we know the work that you have also done in Gaza, but just give us a sense of the situation on the ground. We've heard extensively from Dr. Abu Sita on it, but just what did you see?
It was a huge amount of work to be done, particularly by plastic surgery. It's all shrapnel wounds, blast wounds, burns. The majority of the people that I treated were children. You can see from the footage that the children are, you know, everybody is displaced, there's no homes, so the children are basically running around in the streets outside the hospital. So they get hit by shrapnel after the bombs explode. We had a huge number of kids with sort of amputations, hands, legs, lots of long bone fractures, lots of burns. It was just non-stop, really.
And of course, we continue to report on the fact that hospitals remain overwhelmed, those hospitals that remain standing. We've actually got some material of some children, I believe 8 children, that are going to be evacuated to Italy, who have severe burns. And this is just 8. There are thousands who have been impacted.
From the very beginning, from October, we were seeing that half of the wounded coming through the operating rooms were children. And that has continued. And so now, of the 75,000 wounded, half are children. And these kids, a lot of them have very severe injuries, will need complex surgeries. And what we know, unfortunately, in the long term, from all of the medical literature, is that children with war injuries will need between 8 and 12 surgeries by the time they reach adult age. And so this is a lifetime of surgery awaiting these kids, not just now.
Dr. Rose, what is the responsibility then of governments like here in the UK? Because there are calls to try and evacuate some of these children.
I can understand why the preference has been to evacuate the children to the local countries, because obviously it's difficult. It's a foreign language in the UK that it's going to be difficult for them to communicate. Anyone under 16 has got to come with a relative, so it is a big ask. But I think having recently been to Qatar as well to try and sort out some evacuations, it's very clear that the local countries are flooded. So Qatar now is in a situation where it has 1,000 Gazan patients blocking beds. I mean that in a, not in a derogatory way, but they have nowhere to discharge these patients to once they've treated. And
so there's no clarity about whether they can stay in Qatar. Where do they go?
Well, they can't really stay in Qatar because they need to be moved out so that they can take more, and this is the problem. So Qatar have recently stopped their program of accepting until they can come to some sort of arrangement with Egypt to transfer patients back. So this is going to happen to all the neighbouring countries. I think we need to step in some sort of way, particularly now that places like, as you've shown, Italy and Switzerland and France have taken patients. We are very well placed in the UK to manage these wounds. I mean, we have a huge number of expertise, particularly in orthopaedics and reconstructive surgery. This wouldn't be difficult for the medical teams to cope with. And I think now, even if we took, a few, it would ease the load.
Dr. Abu Sitta, you have just returned this evening from a vigil of a friend of yours, Dr. Adnan al-Bursh, who was declared dead by the Israeli prison authorities after he was believed to have been taken from Al-Shifa Hospital. Just tell us a little bit more about this doctor.
So the reason the vigil was outside King's College Hospital is that he had been trained there. He was the head of orthopedic surgery at Shifa Hospital. And as an ultimate act of dedication to his patients, he remained at Shifa Hospital, even when it was besieged by the Israeli army. When the WHO arranged for the evacuation, he then moved to another hospital in the north, which was then bombed by the Israelis, and he moved to a third hospital where the Israelis arrested him. And that was towards the end of last year. And unfortunately, a few days ago, his family was informed that he had died in prison, and that some of the ex-prisoners had seen evidence of trauma to his face and to his head, indicating that he had been beaten by his prison guards.
You yourself have faced your own level of controversy in the last couple of months. You were banned from entering Germany, banned from entering France last weekend because of accusations that the Israelis have made towards you. They've accused you of being sympathetic to militant groups. Just your response to that.
So the ban to France is actually as a result of a ban that the German authorities had placed on me for all Schengen countries. It's a reflection of the fact that these governments are trying to silence the voices that are calling for a ceasefire. It's an example of how the German government is failing to grasp the idea that it is their duty as the second largest exporter of weapons to Israel to allow the public opinion in Germany to hear the witness statements. And so rather than try to silence the witnesses, rather than hear the witnesses, they're trying to silence the witnesses. And not only have they banned me from going into Germany, they've managed to kind of put a ban for me to enter any of the Schengen area countries. And despite the fact that, my witness evidence was part of the statement of South Africa in the International Court of Justice.
And in the meantime, the situation in Gaza, Dr. Abu Sitta has talked about his situation and that of doctors like Adnan al-Bursh. The hospitals there, the medical staff remain on the front lines of this.
They do, and they're absolutely depleted as well. A lot of the medics that haven't been sort of abducted and killed have sort of been threatened and have left the hospitals. There are staff from Al-Shifa who have come down to the European Gaza hospital, which is the only functioning hospital now in the Gaza Strip. But they've come down and these doctors aren't paid because they're not doctors from the European Gaza hospital. So they're working for free. And even the doctors in the European Gaza hospital aren't paid. They're given a salary once every sort of couple of months, and it's half their salary. So a lot of these doctors are not working. They have decided to look after their relatives who have been injured, or they are the sole carer for their children when the rest of their family has been killed. So there's really, no body of doctors on the ground now. I was assisted mainly by medical students when I was operating.
And we continue to talk about these children who, some of them, if you can give us a sense, UNICEF has said 600,000 remain at risk and shouldn't be evacuated or moved. But from your assessment, what is the number of children that are severely at risk and need to be moved urgently?
So we need to know that 60% of Gaza's population was under the age of 16 when the war started. And therefore, whatever number that there is in any area, 60% of these were children. These children, we understand from UNICEF, are malnourished by 7 months of a manufactured famine. And so they're even at the higher risk of the infectious diseases that are rife because of the breakdown in public health. If they're injured, they're less likely to heal because their malnourished bodies are incapable of healing in this stage. And they have been they had moved with their families to Rafah because they were told at the beginning of the war this is the safe zone, and live in tents, so completely exposed. And if they move again, they will be moving without these tents, so even more exposed, living out in the open, in areas that are overwhelmed by the number of internally displaced.
Okay, Dr. Ghassan Abu Sitta and Dr. Victoria Rose, thank you both for joining us here on the programme. Well, as we were saying...
Well, I'll cover that in a minute, but yeah, that's... I guess that's an easy accusation to make of people that, you're a Hamas sympathiser or working for Hamas, because that's the problem, because Hamas aren't, they're militants or terrorists, I suspect they would call themselves freedom fighters, but because they don't have a uniform, so it's difficult, it means that anyone really could be sympathetic, with any war, same within Nazi Germany, there would have been people who were maybe not fighting for the Germans, or even in European countries, who may have been sympathetic to Nazis' ideology, and you wouldn't know other than when they speak. So yeah, I get it. I often wondered whether, because he was used a lot but then again, most of his testimony didn't have a bias to it, assuming he was telling the truth about what he was operating on, and that I didn't see anything that seemed to be biased in any way other than, but I guess it's an easy thing, you can just say, this person is, and then you can discount their credibility easily, because it's difficult to prove, isn't it? Because he will say, no, I'm not, but of course, how do we know whether he is sympathetic Hamas's view. Or, I mean, I suppose being a Palestinian, he would probably have some sympathy with, because of maybe not with the actions of, but certainly with the idea of wanting a state for Palestine. And of course, those things can blur in a bit. But yeah, I did wonder that.
Well, as we were saying, the situation for anyone in Gaza in need of medical treatment is dangerous. Last week, our US correspondent Mark Stone brought us the story of a family in Washington, D.C., attempting to get another family inside Gaza out to safety. The four parents are united by a rare illness which affects their daughters, Julia and Annabelle. Just have a listen.
Our living condition during the wartime is very difficult. The journey to get her a medicine is full of difficulties. But for me, it's important to get her the medicine rather than to have food for any one of us.
We've been trying to gather a group that can support her. It's been constant communication and really difficult with the translation issues.
From the moment that we first heard, it was really a frenetic kind of, what can we do, what can we do, what can we do? You know, we take such care to protect Annabelle from any possible stimulus that might be hard on her. She is vulnerable, and she's in the most protective, comfortable, safe home that, you know, any child could hope for. And Julia's circumstances are just perilous.
Well, let's go straight to Mark. And Mark, in all of this devastation, I mean, watching your story there, and I urge our viewers to go on our website and look at it. It's about 5.5 minutes, but really a story about kindness and humanity as well in all the heartbreak. And you've got a bit of an update on Julia's story.
Yes, I think it's the individual stories which I think bring the enormity and the humanity at the heart of all of this. Well, I'm afraid to say that Julia is still there because the border, the Rafah border that links Gaza with Egypt, that's the only border through which she and her family could cross, it is closed at the moment, closed a couple of days ago, as we know. So although we think that she is on a list to be evacuated to the UAE, to the United Arab Emirates, she isn't going anywhere at the moment. We did get this latest video from her father that he sent through today. Have a little look at this. This, I'm told by her father, was a moment where she was in the tent. She could hear the singing of the children outside. With AHC, this disease that she's got, noise can either be positive or negative. Music is something that she reacts clearly very well to. But she could have a seizure, perhaps a fatal seizure, at any point from frightening noises, and there are so many of them in Rafah at the moment. So it's really very desperate. It's also fascinating to understand the way that people are able to be evacuated. There are these lists I talk about to get people out. They have to make a judgment about how seriously ill someone is. If they're too ill, there is frankly no point in evacuating them. And the Israeli authorities, the Egyptians and the Palestinian authorities, they all have to check these lists to determine who stays and who gets to leave.
Mark, a heartbreaking story there. Thank you so much for bringing us up to date there on Julia's situation. Now, hundreds of millions of people tune in across the world each year to watch the Eurovision Song Contest.
Right, so here there's two things. One starts with the infected blood scandal, showing that you can't always trust everything, even though everyone says, yeah, you have to trust the authorities and etc. They'll never do anything bad to you. And yet we've got all these investigations. Imagine what else has been going on or is going to go on. But that's not saying that I'm resistant to things, but that's the problem, isn't it? In life we trust. And then after that it is about the oil thing, the gas thing, you know, the funny like they put all these sanctions against Russia, so that they could look, that we're supporting Ukraine. So although it's probably because they get economic benefit out of it, and obviously they don't want countries like Russia because it's their so-called quote enemy. But yeah, anyway, all tags to me. But but still, Russia is selling the gas to someone else, and we're buying it from the third party, and therefore that still means they're generating the money. So the sanctions didn't work, and yet we're still buying it. We must know that it comes from them, and yet it's just like, so it was just face value, there's sanctions. Oh dear.
Of victims of the infected blood scandal have claimed their loved ones were being used for research. Campaigners say historic notes in medical records show some patients in the 1970s and 1980s were given blood plasma treatment, which doctors knew might be infected. Sky's health correspondent Ashish Joshi is here to tell us more about this. Ashish, what have you uncovered on this, and what exactly we're referring to?
Right, so what we're seeing as we approach the publication of the infected blood report on May the 20th is an overwhelming body of evidence which is in the public domain, which is being presented to the infected blood inquiry over the past 5 years. And now families are tying a thread between those documents, which are in the public domain, and their own personal family historic notes for parents they might have lost, or uncles or brothers or sisters, anyone who was undergoing treatment for haemophilia in the 70s and 80s, infected with contaminated blood products. And now campaigners, researchers, and the families are putting this together and piecing together what they have suspected for a very long time, that senior clinicians involved in these trials seemingly to treat haemophiliacs during the 70s and 80s by using this factor VIII product, knowingly were infecting their patients and taking high risks because they knew that there was a very good chance that they were infecting their patients with hepatitis C, HIV, or in some cases both, but certainly with the hepatitis C. So all of this is building pressure as we move towards May the 20th, that there is now a substantial body of evidence which proves what these campaigners, what these bereaved families have been suspecting for a very long time, that these secret trials were taking place and that these clinicians were lobbying the government to continue these trials, knowing that there were great risks involved.
Very quickly, what are we waiting for on May the 20th?
This is the publication of Sir Brian Langstaff's long-awaited report into the infected blood inquiry. It was commissioned in 2017, began in 2018. Tens of thousands of people infected between the 70s and 80s have been fighting for justice for over 50 years, and they hope that this is their day of justice finally.
Ashish, thank you. Now, despite being at war for more than 2 years and facing significant sanctions on its fossil fuel exports, Russia's still making a huge amount of money from its oil and gas industry. That's because, rather than preventing Russian exports, the global market has simply changed the route of how it gets the products around the world. Our economics and data editor, Ed Conway, has been taking a closer look.
Now, one of the main ways that Russia and the Kremlin make money is by exporting lots of oil around the world. That's been part of their business for a long time, and it continues to be part of their business. In fact, if we look at total Russian oil exports outside of Russia, you can see they have come down in terms of the euros, the amount that's been earned since the invasion. But now look at the total amount. Okay, so this is looking at the weight in tons of oil exports, and you can see, well, basically, they are more or less the same as they were before the invasion, so back in February 2022. And this is, in one sense, a little bit odd, because there are all these sanctions on Russia, the UK, the EU, the US. They say they're not going to import Russian oil. They've imposed this price cap. Supposedly, Russia shouldn't be making much money, or as much money from it. But actually, when you look at the revenues that the Kremlin basically earns from all of this oil, I'm going to give you a kind of average here. The 3-month average, look at that red line, it's up to the highest level now since May 2022. Okay, so Russia is still making lots of money from oil, but how are they doing it? Well, here's a clue, okay? Let me just show you who was receiving Russian oil before the invasion of Ukraine. The main recipients were the US, the EU, and China. Now look at how that's shifted, okay? So the geography has shifted. These countries are no longer accepting it, but China, India, and Turkey are. And what's happening there forward is quite interesting. So oil goes from Russia, it goes to places like India, it gets refined, and then because at that point the sanctions don't apply anymore, they've been kind of laundered, that oil can go to Europe. In fact, it can go to the UK. And if you look at Indian oil exports from India to the UK, so before the invasion of Ukraine, they were relatively low. This is various different types of things, so jet fuel, diesel, and so on, from India. Now look what happens after the invasion. They go up quite sharply. So that is oil coming from India that wasn't previously coming. And what we do know, when we look at the various different refineries it comes from, is that, look at the red bits, a lot of that oil and the oil products, whether it's jet fuel, whether it's diesel, that comes to the UK, actually started its life as crude coming from Russia, except that rather than coming directly to the UK, it's gone via India instead.
Ed Conway there, and we will be talking.
Yeah, so there you go. And what's happened is we're all paying more for it. The next one. Israel Hamas.
Well, the US President Joe Biden says that the US will stop weapons shipments to Israel if it invades the Gazan city of Rafah, but said it will continue supplying defensive systems. Speaking to CNN, the US President also admitted US weapons used by Israel have killed civilians in Gaza.
Civilians have been killed in Gaza as a consequence of those bombs and other ways in which they go after population centers. I made it clear that if they go into Rafah, they haven't gone into Rafah yet. If they go into Rafah, I'm not supplying the weapons that have been used historically to deal with Rafah, to deal with the cities, to deal with that problem. We're going to continue to make sure Israel is secure in terms of Iron Dome and their ability to respond to attacks like came out of the Middle East recently. But it's just wrong. We're not going to supply the weapons.
Correspondent Alistair Bunkle joins me now live from Jerusalem. Ali, very good morning to you. Yesterday we were talking about the extent to which this message might have reached the Israeli government when it was based on reports and loose lines here or there. This was explicit. It was loud and clear.
Yeah, the US president has taken out his marker and drawn a big fat red line, and that is that if the Israelis do press ahead and go into Rafah, then the Americans will take action, and the action will be the withholding of weapon shipments that the Israelis would normally expect. Now, as the US president outlined in that clip there, this is about offensive weapons, not defensive weapons. So we're not talking about resupplying the Iron Dome system, for example. The Americans would still do that so that Israel could protect itself from Hamas, from Hezbollah, but also they would enable Israel to protect themselves from any threat from Iran. This is about restricting weapons transfers that could be used during any operation in Gaza. And I think it goes further than that. It shows that the US administration, even though we would have suspected it, it shows that they are fully aware that the way Israel has prosecuted the war so far, in some cases, has not been to their liking. And I think that's to put it mildly, because the US president, referenced civilian deaths there, the use of very, very heavy munitions, munitions that are frankly too heavy to be used or unnecessarily heavy in dense urban areas. And the Americans are very worried that that's what will happen in Rafah. And so they've laid down a red line, and Netanyahu now has a choice. They won't like it, the Israelis, but he has a choice. And there have been other leaders around the world who have seen the Americans, like Obama and Biden before, lay down red lines, and they've ignored it and they've crossed it. Will Netanyahu do the same?
I just finally, Ali, quickly, was wondering how this will have been read by Hamas's leadership, more broadly across the region, that this warning to Israel from the US, as explicit as it was?
Yeah, I mean, never make the mistake that Hamas are underground in Gaza and unaware of what is going on. They are acutely aware of every development outside of Gaza. They see anti-government demonstrations in Israel, for example, and they see how global sentiment is gradually growing against Israel's actions. So they will know about this, and of course, naturally, you assume it will embolden them. And I'm sure the Israelis will make that point to the Americans and to others, because perhaps now we look to Germany. Germany is, perhaps surprisingly, the second largest weapon supplier to Israel. Will they follow suit? And so I'm sure the Israelis will be making that point. You know, by taking this action, all you are doing is you are encouraging Hamas and you're preventing Israel from defeating Hamas. The Americans will counter that. They'll say, look, there are other ways to deal with Rafah. There are other options to try and get Cenury. Going in full scale is not is not necessary. That's what the Americans will say. And now you have a difference of opinion, which has always been the case. We've known that the Americans have opposed this potential invasion of Rafah, but now you have a clear threat, let's put it like that, from the White House.
Ali Buncle, as always, thanks so much. And of course, we'll be discussing the latest situation there with the government. Gillian Keegan in a moment, but first.
From one war zone to another.
Well, something else occupying Lord Cameron will be the Ukraine war, and residents are continuing to flee the under-attack city of Vovchansk in the east of the country. Russia says its troops have taken 5 villages since its soldiers crossed the border in a surprise attack, something which Kyiv denies. Russian forces have so far launched 2 limited advances in the area, one north of Kharkiv city and one near Vovchansk, with civilians being evacuated from there. Our security and defence editor Deborah Haynes is in Vovchansk for us this weekend and sent us this report. Just a warning, it does contain pictures of an injury that one civilian has suffered.
The reality of life under Russian fire. A huge blast shattered this residential block. No sign of firefighters yet, but then this town is a war zone. He says the blaze must be stopped because it could spread and pensioners live here. Another resident, Valentina, is scared, but she says she doesn't want to leave. Amid the destruction, there's anger.
The building was full of elderly people. They struck just next to our home.
Miraculously, no one died.
I was in my apartment. There was a huge explosion and all the shards of glass fell down on me.
Despite the danger, she too doesn't want to be evacuated, even though she's wounded.
The bomb landed here just a bit earlier. You can see it's left a devastating crater. It's blasted this house. Residents, civilians were living here. There's a civilian residential block next door. People are panicking that the fire in here is going to ignite fires in their homes too. They're terrified, they're confused. People don't want to leave even though help is here to evacuate them. They say they want to sort out their belongings first. It's absolute chaos.
We head further into Vovchansk. The town centre lies in ruins. Some damage had been inflicted by previous Russian shelling over recent months. But then this place was targeted in a major assault early on Friday morning. Residents have been told to flee, but now and then there's the shortest glimpse of life.
The centre of the town is absolutely devastated, buildings destroyed. We can hear the sound of explosions. It's empty. There's clearly a battle still going on here.
On the way out of town, evidence of fresh strikes. A police officer who came with us says the carnage is hard to witness.
I feel outraged, a sense of injustice, that innocent people are suffering like this. We help them in any way we can.
That includes evacuating those who are willing to go, and not just from Vovchansk, but also nearby villages next to Russia's border as fighting rages. This family only returned to the area after a Ukrainian counteroffensive pushed Russian forces out when Moscow first invaded 2 years ago. But now they're fleeing again.
We didn't sleep at all last night. There was shelling. They hit the hospital next to us, and all our windows shattered.
And do you think you'll ever be able to go home?
We have our animals there. We have our pigs, chickens, our dogs, our cats. When everything is okay, we will come home.
A hope doubtless held by everyone here. But it will depend on whether Ukraine once again can reverse the Russian advance. Deborah Haynes, Sky News, Vovchansk, northeastern Ukraine.
Well, lines coming from the Ukrainian authorities in the past few minutes actually say that fighting is ongoing in the Kharkiv region. The situation is difficult. That's coming from Ukraine's military chief. So let's get an update now from Deborah in Kharkiv.
We're in Kharkiv city, which thankfully for now isn't under Russian artillery fire. You'll remember at the beginning of Russia's full-scale invasion, this city was one of the key targets. It managed to withstand the invasion. Russian forces came across the border here in the northeast. It shares a long border with Ukraine. They managed to take swathes of territory across this region. But then in September of that year, the Ukrainian counteroffensive pushed the Russians out, and this city had been saved. It has since then been under missile fire from the Russians, and there had been artillery strikes, drone strikes in the border region, the villages and the odd town that is close to Russia's border here in this region. But in the early hours of Friday morning, the Russian military launched a significant new assault, reopening a new front in this war. There are battles ongoing right now across that border region, with Russia saying that they have captured 5 villages. The Ukrainian president said last night that there's fighting going on around 7 villages.
Deborah Haynes in Kharkiv for us. Well, just across the border in Belgorod, Russian state media is saying 7 people have been killed and more than 10 may be under the rubble after a section of an apartment block collapsed in an apparent Ukrainian missile strike. The city's governor says several hundred flats have been damaged in Ukrainian attacks this weekend. Initial reports from Russian media suggest 20 people could be buried under rubble.
This is what we're doing to each other.
The infected blood scandal is considered to be the worst treatment disaster in the history of the NHS. Much of the focus has been on people with haemophilia, given contaminated blood products. But as the inquiry prepares to publish its final report, Sky News has been looking at the tens of thousands infected via blood transfusions given in the NHS. Documents reveal how blood was regularly collected from high-risk environments like prisons, and some blood services missed chances to stop it. Our science and technology editor Tom Clark has this report.
Janice Whitehorn is making wedding dresses again. She built the business but nearly lost it after aggressive treatment for hepatitis C virus left her unable to work. She only found out she had the potentially fatal viral infection in 2019, passed on to her by her mother, Daff, who went 20 years without knowing she got it from a blood transfusion in the early 1970s.
I felt so guilty that I'd passed it on, and I didn't know that I could pass it on because I wasn't told anything about it. So I felt ever so guilty, and I'll always feel guilty.
Not your fault.
Oh, no, it's not. Yeah.
They're looking to the infected blood inquiry for answers. Most attention has been focused on haemophiliacs, the group harmed most in this scandal by blood products imported from America. But far more people were infected with hepatitis C, like Daff and Janice, via transfusions here in the UK. Documents given to the inquiry show how up until the early 1990s, compared to the standards of today, the UK blood supply was far from safe. One startling revelation, the UK Blood Service regularly collected blood from prisons, despite evidence at the time that prisoners were 5 times more likely to be infected with hepatitis viruses. And despite warnings, the practice continued up until 1987. Today, things are different. Around 800,000 people regularly give blood, including me. There's a questionnaire about lifestyle habits, illnesses and travel history, then a brief consultation before a donation. So at the start of my donation, the staff took 3 tubes of my blood. Part of one of these is used to archive a sample of my donation. Another is used to test for viruses like HIV and hepatitis. And the Blood Service say steps like that have radically improved the safety of blood transfusion and donation in the UK. Not so in the past, and the numbers, only estimates because records have been lost or destroyed, bear this out. The inquiry calculates around 27,000 people were infected with hepatitis C via routine transfusions for surgery, childbirth or cancer treatment. The majority have since died of other causes, but around 1,600 are thought to have died so far from illnesses like liver cancer caused by hepatitis C.
We have apologised, but we remain very sorry that those events happened. Today, though, my job as Chief Medical Officer is to ensure that the blood supply today is safe.
But there are many more questions the infected blood inquiry must answer, like why? And why were there clear delays and failures to look back, identify and compensate those infected, like Daff and Janice Whitehorn? Failures that left them and thousands more unknowingly infected, risking their health and that of others for decades. Tom Clark, Sky News.
Well, Tom joins us to discuss this further as we bring in Joan Edgington, who was infected with hepatitis C through a contaminated blood transfusion during surgery in 1991. Joan, thanks so much for joining us. And I want to get to what you're hoping to learn from the end of the investigation, the inquiry and the report. But just tell us, first of all, how you were a victim of the scandal and when you were informed about it, what it felt like.
In a way, this is a good story to follow your earlier piece because my story is simplistic in comparison. I was infected through transfusion during surgery in 91, January 91. Because of that, I then was part of the look back exercise where 4 years later I got a letter from the transfusion service, as was then, basically saying, sorry, no, they didn't say sorry at that point. I must correct myself. I had a letter just inviting me to an appointment for a blood test, and you go into a sort of limbo waiting for that. Then I had the blood test, and then from there was another wait for a result. Went to the hospital, and a gentleman in a white coat invited me into a small ante-room and informed me that I did have Hep C. Up until then, I thought it was just a low chance, but obviously they were looking at the whole contamination network. And from there, I was just informed about the risks, as in the blood carries the virus, so be careful about sharing toothbrush, razors, and of course any blood spills, which for women is difficult. And that was it. I left with a leaflet. And I remember sitting in the hospital car park just wondering what on earth the next chapter would be for me, because then I was single parent with 2 daughters and trying to hold down a full-time job. So that was the beginning of the story. I was fortunate to have a supportive GP, and he admitted not knowing much about it, advised that I didn't spend a lot of time on the internet because I'd scare myself. And between us, we started researching and found that this virus had a definite ability to kill people if not carefully monitored and hopefully treated. But at that point, there was no treatment. I had been incredibly fit. Sorry, yeah.
Joan, I was just,
I thought you were going to ask
sorry to interrupt. It's Tom Clark here who just did that report. I'm curious to know how much support you've had, because I think one of the feelings among a lot of the victims is it took so long for them to find out, but also then to get the support they needed, advice on treatment, what to do about it. What are you expecting from the inquiry?
We're hoping that everybody who's been affected and infected are included. So that will be people past the cut-off date that they've put in at the moment. It's based on when an accurate test was introduced, but they didn't, as far as we know, recall any of the blood products or blood already out in the system. And we definitely know that people within our cohort were infected past
That's right.
September.
You would have been infected after testing was introduced. Is that right? You were infected.
I was right up to the finish line, if you like. They did have a test. England refused to use it because of costs, because it did throw up a lot of false positives. So I can understand they were worried about waste. But when you look at other countries around the world, they certainly were already introducing these tests, even though it meant sometimes good blood was thrown away. And to know that and not be told of the risk before you had the transfusion, and again, the follow-up and care after you've been told. Really, we were just informed, but there was no support, no general recommendation about your own health care. I had no information about diet or anything like that. And just had to be proactive.
As we await the report, I mean, do you see this as a moment you've been waiting for years and are filled with hope? Or are you somewhat worried that it might not deliver what you're looking for?
The whole inquiry has been an incredible process. To band together when you'd spent so much time feeling you were the only one was such a positive experience. But then knowing the depth and finding out through the inquiry, it's been a huge learning curve, that there was active cover-up, that there's been denial because of that cover-up. And the worst of that then means there wasn't care and awareness within the medical profession in general. So from this, we've already, as your piece shows, the transfusion service is a totally different thing now, and that's wonderful. I think the NHS has really looked at how to improve services. The bit that worries me is there's still no new system to hold the government or the policymakers or the system to account. We have watchdogs for various things like the schools, the health ministers and everybody else, but not these policy-making decisions. And that's what really impacted on us, was the decisions made by politicians who had no background in health issues as far as we can see, not since David Owen, who at that time when he was in post had tried to make UK totally self-sufficient, and that would have protected us all.
Joan, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your story.
Thank you for the time.
As Israel inches closer to an attack on Rafah, millions are trapped with no way out. But that hasn't held back a group of British doctors who've entered southern Gaza hoping to save lives. John Sparks has spoken to one of them, and a warning that John's report contains content that some viewers might find distressing.
This is a dangerous place to be a doctor. The European hospital is the only facility still functioning east of Rafah, with an Israeli military operation perilously close to its doors. A few days earlier, 3 British medics began a placement here, and we managed to speak to one, an orthopedic surgeon called Mohammed Tahir. Tell me a bit about what the last couple of days have been like.
In the last few days, with the intensifying of the bombing in Rafah, we are getting just mainly blast injuries here. People, literally, their limbs and their bodies torn to shreds.
When did you arrive?
I'll be honest with you, I mean, right now, night, day of the week, has all evaporated. So I've lost track of time. I was circa around 1.5 weeks ago. I just keep operating. I don't stop for lunch. I don't stop for dinner.
This is quite a moment in this conflict that you have arrived at.
I'll be honest with you. Before coming here, I was warned by several friends, do not go now because the Rafah invasion is imminent and you are going at a very, very dangerous time. I was anxious. I was a little bit scared to come. But then I thought to myself, if not me, then who?
Dr. Tahir hasn't worked in a war zone before. It's his first time. We see him here after he amputated the legs of a husband and his wife, but he couldn't save them. Their children perished at the scene of the blast. But this is the reality of his new existence. He's treated 150 patients in the past 10 days.
I think it was either an airstrike in which parents were killed. There were two small children, one of whom we tried to resuscitate, but he was covered in burns from head to toe, and we called it. He died, and his sister by the side was also covered in wounds, massive wound to her forehead where her skull was exposed and she had a skull fracture too. And I'm there looking at these two children, wondering, what did they do?
Can you describe the hospital for me? Just take me for a walk through the corridors.
This is a refugee camp. You have people, children, women sleeping on floors, in corridors, on stairs even, with makeshift tents inside, tents outside too. There are a lot of families here looking for shelter because they know outside of the perimeter of this hospital they can be killed.
The Israelis say that their operation in southern Gaza is limited, it's precise, it's a counter-terrorism operation.
What I see on the floor in real life is very different to that.
The Rafah crossing, which is the main humanitarian corridor in and out of Gaza, is shut. It's closed, which means that you can't leave. Not at the moment, anyway. I'm wondering how you feel about that.
I feel for my family, not for myself. I know that they are terrified. I know that my friends and family are really concerned for my well-being, and I think it hurts them more than it hurts me. But the intensity of the feeling that I have because of the tragedies that I'm seeing, because of the suffering I'm seeing, I just feel like it cannot stop. I have to keep going and going and going and going. There is no time to rest.
It's a calling and a commitment, and it will be tested. John Sparks, Sky News in Jerusalem.
The things we do to each other. That shows the best of humanity, I guess.
Hello, very good morning, and thanks for joining us here on The Breakfast Show. After more than 6 decades of systemic, collective and individual failings which led to the deaths of thousands of people, the Infected Blood Inquiry will publish its long-awaited report on Monday. It's believed to be the biggest treatment disaster in NHS history. Victims are campaigning not only for compensation, but for an apology and for the truth of what happened to them and their families. Our health correspondent, Ashish Joshi, reports.
That, believe it or not, is the sheet he died on.
Colin Smith was just 7 years old when he died, his tiny body ravaged by hepatitis C and AIDS. Colin was born with haemophilia. The treatment for his blood clotting disorder included a product called Factor 8. What his parents didn't know was that the Factor 8 was made in America, using blood farmed from prisoners, drug addicts, and sex workers.
I think it was about 89 that we realised, because the weight loss was incredible, and we had him home for a little while, and you couldn't just pick him up. We had to use a sheepskin because it hurt him. You know, he said, "Mummy, you're hurting," because he was 13 pounds when he died. That's nothing, is it?
For a 7-year-old.
For a 7-year-old.
Colin was treated by Professor Arthur Bloom, who died in 1992. But in the 1980s, he was one of the country's leading haemophiliac specialists. But documents shown at the Infected Blood Inquiry proved Bloom's research carried great risks, and these were never explained to Colin's parents. This record of the first time Colin went into hospital shows that he has never been treated for his haemophilia at this point. Previously untreated patients were useful for research as their responses to new treatments could be tracked. Patients like Colin. This is a letter from Professor Bloom to a colleague after another visit by Colin to hospital, saying he's been given factor 8 and acknowledging that even though this was the British version, there was still a risk of hepatitis, but that this is just something haemophiliacs have to accept.
I think Colin was just unlucky enough to be born at the right time. Newly diagnosed haemophiliac, never been treated, which is what they were after, because the documentation states that they're cheaper than chimpanzees. You can only treat a chimp once. You can follow these children throughout their lives, and that's what was going on.
As Colin's condition deteriorated, his parents decided to bring him home for what would be his last Christmas with the family.
My hand was on his chest, and you know, for a mother to actually feel the rise and fall of his chest, waiting for it to stop, because that's what I was doing. I was waiting for it to stop, and then it stopped. And I just said to you, didn't I think he's gone. And I can remember shaking him a little bit, but he's gone.
I want justice to be served properly, not, hypothetically. Let's see the people who did this, hopefully criminal charges. If not, as far as I'm concerned, it's manslaughter at least.
I want people to recognise my son, and I want to be able to go to a cemetery and say, we've done it, darling, you've done it. I want my son to have his name back. His name was Colin John Smith, and that's what I want people to remember.
Ashish Joshi, Sky News.
And you can watch Ashish's full report here on Sky News.
It's terrible, really, to think that the pictures of that 7-year-old looking sick. Just another failing in the system, because it's all about money, it's all about, the way we don't work together with each other, so they have to do these trials and things. I mean, they shouldn't have been doing that on people that didn't sign up to do it. I mean, and these were people that were respected and, the head of their field, and this is what they were doing and writing, saying, they just have to put up with that. So how do you know that the person when you go to can be trusted anymore?
Monday, we'll have full coverage from 6 a.m. here on Sky News Breakfast, and with Sarah Jane Mee live at the inquiry from 10 o'clock in the morning. Fighting has resumed in northern Gaza overnight in one of the fiercest battles seen since Israeli forces returned to the area a week ago. Israel's armed forces vowed to leave no stone unturned after recovering the bodies of 3 hostages on Thursday night who were killed in the October the 7th attack. Our Middle East correspondent, Alistair Bunkle, reports.
Itzhak Galarenta, Amit Buskila and Shani Luke were all killed at the Nova Music Festival on October the 7th, and their bodies taken into Gaza. On Thursday night, the Israeli military recovered their corpses during an operation in the city of Rafah.
They were celebrating life in the Nova Music Festival, and they were murdered by Hamas. We will leave no stone unturned. We will do everything in our power to find our hostages and bring them home. We will not rest until we do.
The video of a lifeless Shani Luke being abducted by Hamas terrorists and put onto the back of a truck became one of the most infamous images of that dark day. Her brother spoke to Sky News last year.
It was so hard to actually see this brutality, even though in our countries we know that they can reach to this level of non-humanity. They just spit on her and treat her like she's such a nothing. She means nothing for them.
Israeli forces are slowly pushing deeper into Rafah despite international opposition.
One reason is because they are convinced that many of the hostages are being held there. The discovery of the 3 hostages, albeit dead, will perhaps give them confidence that more can be found there. 2 months after it was first announced, and after a few weeks' delay, the first lorries of aid drove off the new US floating pier in Gaza. British aid, including thousands of temporary shelters, was on board the first shipment to arrive. The causeway stretches a few hundred meters from the shore. US forces will not set foot on Gaza, but the aid will first be secured by the IDF and then delivered by the United Nations. This is a new route for aid into Gaza, but the land crossings remain the best way of getting aid in. They are controlled by Israel, though, and not always open. Aid agencies are now warning of an epidemic as summer temperatures rise, there is little fresh water, and human waste runs like rivers in the streets.
As much as we need aid in getting into Gaza, we also need this war machine to stop so that we can save our lives and we can work as humanitarian aid workers more safely and reach all people who are in dire need for aid as well.
Only a few kilometers inland from the port, the fighting is heavy. Israeli forces have returned to northern Gaza as Hamas has regrouped there. There were reportedly 30 people in this house in the Jabalia refugee camp. 6 bodies were pulled from the rubble. The rest are still thought to be underneath. The new pier might bring some hope, but many Gazans see the US Navy ships and don't understand why the Americans are giving them aid at the same time that they're giving Israel weapons. Especially as right now, this war shows no sign of ending anytime soon. Alistair Bungle, Sky News, in Jerusalem.
At least 1 man has been killed and several people injured in an Israeli airstrike on a refugee camp in Jenin in the occupied West Bank. The IDF said it targeted an operations centre of a militant group, claiming the attack was carried out to remove an imminent threat. Here in the UK, thousands of pro-Palestinian protesters will demonstrate in central London today. They're calling for the end of Israel's bombardment of Gaza in marches which mark the 76th anniversary of the Nakba, the name given to the forced displacement of over 700,000 Palestinians from what is now Israel. And we'll be live at the protests throughout the day and hearing from organisers.
Right, so there's another collection of Sky News things, going over different things, like with the infected blood scandal that's been going for over 50 years, along with, although we didn't cover it in this one, but the Primados, that's been going for the same amount of time, COVID-19, although that's only, that hasn't taken 50 years because we all experienced it, so I guess they couldn't sort of hide that one because everyone was awaiting an investigation. But it just goes to show that, you know, often people say, wow, this was in the 50s or 60s, things are better now. Well, evidently not, because we're doing the COVID inquiry and we're finding lots of scandals and things and handouts and employing, you know, giving contracts to people that you know, turning a blind eye to science and what should be done for the benefit of money or for expediency or whatever other reason, due to lack of knowledge. Politicians still making medical decisions when they don't have the medical knowledge to do so. That's the problem, that the policy makers are politicians. And a politician can have any kind of qualification to become a politician or none. And then make these massive decisions that affect lives, and which then doctors and qualified people have to then follow as their process. It seems madness that politicians are able to make such things without, I mean, nowadays they use medical advice like they did with the COVID-19, but a lot of the time the medical advice was just ignored, you know, over their knowledge, which wasn't better. This is the world we live in, so things aren't really changing. The same things are happening. And because the different generation of humans are born, and they all think, oh well, let's, because we're born in the system of money, and we're born in this system of power and greed and division and all that kind of stuff, that it breeds or allows the breeding of such ideas and thoughts and policies and procedures. And until we get to that root cause, this is always going to happen, and it always has been happening. Probably a lot more that's not on mainstream media because people don't know about it, or there's not enough, it's very difficult to get the media attention. Anyway, so it's got that, and also got the Hamas and Gaza situation from both sides, showing just like removing the tags, because if you keep the tags, then there'd be one side that would be pro Israel, one side that's pro Palestine, and remove the tags and just see them as human beings. Let's be pro-human beings. Let's not use these tags of names of bits of land and divisions of humanity that people thousands of years before you created. And they only created it for what? They didn't create it so you could be patriotic. They created it so that they could divide, so that they could have, this is mine and you are mine. I am your king. I am your sheriff. I am your prime minister, your president, your premier, and you must do as I say. Because remember, long before when land was divided, this was the type of mentality of these people, that it was so that they could govern, your mentality, government. They could govern you. It wasn't for the betterment of humanity, because it isn't for the betterment of humanity to divide us up and to fight against each other and not to pull resources to keep this system alive of banks and money and lawyers and solicitors and all the stuff that keeps us fighting each other. So yeah, it just goes to show that when you take these tags away, you just see these two sets of human beings fighting over this bit of land that they can never ever own, but only inhabit while they're alive, and dying for it in horrible ways from both sides, whether it's the terrorist action of Hamas on October the 7th and continuing with the hostages and whatever they're doing in retaliating, and then there's Israel, another set of human beings when they're doing using emissions that are too big for the cramped areas, killing lots of civilians, if that's what's actually happening. According to President Biden, that seems to be the case, and the United Nations and the Western media, although the IDF and Israel would counter that and say it's not. They say it's Hamas propaganda that's being... But this is the problem, you see, with propaganda. Once you use that word, and in a war, like I say, the first casualty is always true, so you never know who to believe. Even your own politicians or media could be misleading, like within the Iraq and Afghanistan's war, when we were led to believe, when Tony Blair and George W. Bush lied to us about weapons of mass destruction that were never ever found, and probably were never there, especially because they had lots of UN resolutions that were checking these things in the first place. And it was just an excuse to be able to get in there, because Saddam Hussein wasn't allowing them to check. But all maybe about oil anyway. But it stems back. Why did they do that? It stems back to the same thing, to our mentality of seeing each other as divided, of seeing you as different than me. But we're not. We're all human beings. We all share the same existence, the same experience, our one experience of living on this place. And we should be living harmoniously, working together with the resources that we've been freely given, and that we've decided to put price tags on and compete with each other in our day-to-day lives. How silly and stupid and is that? Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed these things. Please leave your comments. Take care, take it easy, God bless, and peace.